What would you do if you knew you were about to starve to death in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by enemies who showed no mercy? This was the reality faced by thousands of sailors during what many historians consider the most brutal naval conflict in modern history. But what war was this, and why does it remain shrouded in mystery, even decades after it ended? The answer takes us back to 1939, when the world stood on the brink of a catastrophe that would forever change the nature of naval warfare. We're not just talking about epic battles between warships. We're talking about a silent war, fought in the depths of the Atlantic, where death came without warning and without honor. Imagine for a moment, you're on the deck of a merchant ship transporting vital supplies to Europe. The sun is setting on the horizon, painting the ocean a deep red that, at this moment, you don't yet realize symbolizes the blood that will soon stain these waters. Suddenly, without any warning, a deafening explosion tears through the silence. The ship tilts violently, and you realize you have only minutes, perhaps seconds, before the icy sea swallows you forever. This was the reality of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most devastating naval confrontation of World War II. But why was this particular war so different from all the others? And what was the human cost of such unprecedented brutality? To understand the magnitude of this war, we need to go back to the beginning. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Hitler knew he was facing a war on multiple fronts. The German strategy wasn't just about conquering land, it was about economically strangling their enemies by cutting off their vital supply lines. And where were these lines most vulnerable? In the vast Atlantic Ocean, the Germans had a secret weapon that would forever change the nature of naval warfare, the U-boat or Unterseeboot. These submarines weren't just machines of war. They were silent predators, capable of emerging from the depths without warning, striking with lethal precision and vanishing again into the dark waters. But did you know that many of these submarines were crewed by young men just 18 or 19 years old? Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, developed a tactic he called unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that any ship, military or civilian, carrying supplies to the Allies would be considered a legitimate target. There was no distinction between warships and hospital ships, between military cargo vessels and civilian transports. The brutality of this decision would only become clear when the sea began to turn red. But here's the question that haunts many historians. Why did the Germans choose such a cruel strategy? The answer lies in the bitter lessons of World War I. Between 1914 and 1918, the Germans had experienced the British naval blockade, which caused widespread starvation and contributed to their defeat. Now, 2 decades later, they were determined to turn the tables. The first major blow came early in the war. On September 17, 1939, U-29, commanded by Captain Otto Schuhart, detected a signal on sonar. What he didn't know was that he was about to sink the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous, taking 518 sailors with it to the bottom of the ocean. This attack was not just a military blow. It was a sign that the rules of naval warfare had changed forever. But the true brutality of German submarine warfare wasn't just in the number of ships sunk. It was in the way the attacks were carried out. German submarines often attacked convoys in the middle of the night, when the darkness provided maximum cover. Sailors would wake to the sound of exploding torpedoes, metal tearing apart, and freezing water flooding their ships. Many didn't even make it out of their bunks. Can you imagine the terror of being on a sinking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic in the dead of winter with water temperatures below freezing? Survivors who made it to lifeboats faced a terrible choice: die of cold, hunger, or thirst, or be killed in another submarine attack. Because yes, U-boats often returned to attack the lifeboats. This practice, which violated all international conventions of war, was one of the most controversial aspects of the Battle of the Atlantic. But why did German commanders order such actions? The official reason was that survivors could provide valuable information about U-boat movements. The reality was far more sinister. The goal was to sow terror among merchant crews, making many refuse to board ships. In 1940, the situation became even more desperate for the Allies. Germany occupied France and gained access to Atlantic naval bases. drastically reducing the distance their submarines had to travel to strike British convoys. Dönitz called this period the Happy Time, a name that sounds almost obscene when you consider the human suffering it represented. But what was the real impact of this brutal war? The numbers are staggering. Over the 6 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, more than 3,500 merchant ships were sunk. That represents approximately 14.5 million tons of ships and cargo. But behind those cold numbers lies a human tragedy of epic proportions. More than 72,000 Allied sailors lost their lives in those freezing waters. Did you know that many of those sailors were civilian volunteers? Ordinary men who left their families to transport vital supplies, food, fuel, weapons, and medicine, to keep free Europe alive. They knew the risks, they knew they were sailing through a maritime graveyard, but they kept going because they understood that their courage was all that stood between civilization and chaos. On the German side, the brutality of the war also took a terrible toll. Of the 1,162 U-boats that took part in the war, 785 were sunk. Of the 40,000 men who served in the German submarine fleet, only 10,000 survived. That's a 75% mortality rate, the highest of any German military branch during World War II. But there was something even more disturbing about the German submarine war. Many U-boats disappeared without a trace, their crews simply vanishing into the ocean abyss. Entire families never learned what happened to their sons, husbands, or fathers. They simply went on a mission and never came back. How many secrets and human stories lie buried in the depths of the Atlantic? The brutality of this war was not limited to direct combat. The German strategy also included what they called psychological warfare. U-boats often remained on the surface after sinking a ship, watching the survivors struggle against the icy waves. Some German commanders reported hearing the screams of drowning men, but were ordered not to offer help. This dehumanization of the enemy was an integral part of the German strategy. Merchant sailors were not seen as combatants, but as instruments of war that needed to be eliminated. German documents from the time reveal explicit instructions not to rescue survivors, even when it could be done without compromising the submarine's safety. But how did the Allies respond to this brutality? The answer came in the form of one of the greatest intelligence operations of the war, the breaking of the Enigma code. In 1941, British cryptographers managed to decipher German communications, allowing them to predict where the U-boats would be positioned. But this advantage came at a terrible moral cost. Allied commanders often knew a convoy would be attacked, but they couldn't alter its route without revealing that the German code had been broken. This meant they sometimes had to let ships be sunk and men die to preserve a greater strategic advantage. How many sailors were sacrificed to keep that secret? The war in the Atlantic was also marked by some of the most controversial acts on both sides. In 1942, the German submarine U-852 sank the Greek ship Peleus and then strafed the survivors who were in lifeboats. When the war ended, those responsible were tried for war crimes. But how many similar incidents were never documented? On the Allied side, the response was equally brutal. When Allied destroyers located a damaged U-boat on the surface, they rarely showed mercy. The standard practice was to keep attacking until the submarine was completely destroyed, even when the crew tried to surrender. The justification was that German submarines had shown such cruelty that they did not deserve mercy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic was the age of many of the combatants. German records reveal that many U-boat crews were made up of teenagers. Boys aged 17 and 18 were sent to the bottom of the ocean to fight a war they could barely comprehend. How many of those young men died without ever truly living? The brutality of the war also manifested in the length of the conflict. Unlike land battles, which could last days or weeks, the Battle of the Atlantic stretched for nearly 6 uninterrupted years. That means for over 2,000 days, the Atlantic Ocean was an active battlefield, where death could come at any time, in any place. Merchant sailors who survived the war reported that the most terrifying aspect wasn't the attacks themselves, but the constant tension. They knew that at any moment, a torpedo could tear through their ship's hull. Many developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder but at the time it was simply called combat fatigue. Some survivors described recurring dreams in which they could hear the sound of approaching torpedoes, even decades after the war had ended. Others reported never being able to sleep deeply again, always alert for any noise that might indicate danger. The war in the Atlantic did not end in 1945 for these men. It continued haunting their minds for the rest of their lives. But why was this particular war so brutal? The answer lies in the unique nature of naval combat. In land warfare, a wounded soldier still had a chance to survive. At sea, especially in the North Atlantic, a damaged ship almost certainly meant death. The waters were so cold that survival was measured in minutes, not hours. Furthermore, the vastness of the ocean meant that rescue was often impossible. When a ship was sunk, survivors could float in lifeboats for weeks before being found, if they were found. Many simply vanished, swallowed by the sea without a trace. The technology of the time also contributed to the brutality. Sonar was primitive, radar was new and unreliable, and communication was limited. This meant that attacks often caught victims completely off guard. A ship could be sailing peacefully on a sunny afternoon, and in the next moment be split in two by a torpedo. The Germans also developed weapons specifically designed to maximize suffering. The acoustic torpedo, for example, was programmed to explode beneath the ship, breaking its spine and causing it to sink in minutes. There was no time to evacuate properly, no time to send distress signals. Death was swift and inexorable. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of the German submarine war was how it dehumanized both the attackers and the victims. U-boat commanders often referred to the ships they sank only as tonnage, reducing human lives to statistics. Likewise, the Allies began to see German submarines not as vessels crewed by humans, but as mechanical predators that needed to be destroyed. This dehumanization had lasting consequences. Many veterans on both sides reported that the experience of the Battle of the Atlantic fundamentally changed their view on the value of human life. They had seen so much death, so much suffering, that they became emotionally numb. The war had stolen not only their lives, but their humanity. As the war progressed, the brutality only intensified. In 1943, as the tide began to turn against the Germans, Dönitz ordered his commanders to be even more aggressive. U-boats began attacking hospital ships, rescue vessels, and even lifeboats. The justification was that the war had become a matter of national survival, and anything that weakened the enemy was justifiable. But this escalation of violence came at a price. As the U-boats became more desperate, they also became more reckless. Many were detected and sunk because their commanders took unnecessary risks in an attempt to inflict maximum damage. The very brutality of the German war effort ultimately contributed to its defeat. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Atlantic Ocean had become a vast graveyard. It is estimated that more than 5,000 ships from all nationalities lie at the bottom of the Atlantic, each containing stories of courage, terror, and human sacrifice. How many of these stories will never be told? The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic remains with us today. The icy waters of the North Atlantic still hold the wreckage of thousands of ships and the remains of tens of thousands of sailors who never returned home. Each of these men had a story, a family, dreams, and fears. They were consumed by a war that turned the ocean into a killing field. But perhaps the most important lesson of this brutal war is that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are still examples of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The sailors who kept sailing despite knowing they would likely die, the commanders who chose to save lives instead of seeking glory, the survivors who found the strength to keep living after enduring the unimaginable. The most brutal war at sea was not just a clash between nations or ideologies. It was a fundamental test of the human spirit, a measure of how far men can be pushed before they break. And though many did break, many others found an inner strength they never knew they had. Today, as we peacefully sail the oceans, it's hard to imagine that these same waters were once the scene of such immense suffering. But the depths of the Atlantic remind us that peace is precious, that humanity is fragile, and that we must always remember those who paid the ultimate price so that we could live in freedom. The true tragedy of the Battle of the Atlantic lies not only in the number of dead, but in the fact that so many lives were lost in such brutal and senseless ways. Men who might have contributed to science, art, family, and society were reduced to war statistics, their stories forever lost to the depths of the sea. And so we end where we began, with a question. After learning this history, after understanding the human cost of the most brutal war ever fought at sea, how can we honor the memory of these brave men who gave their lives so that others could live free? Perhaps the answer lies in never forgetting that behind every wartime statistic was a human being with hopes, fears, and dreams who deserved far more than a cold, dark ocean as their final grave.